So I don't know how many of you have, but I've grown up in the church. I knew all the right answers, all the right beliefs, and all the right emotions. I knew when to raise my hands, when to sit down, stand up, and everything. But I didn't really know how to follow Jesus. And that was because my faith wasn't my own. It was just simply my parents. I grew up and I went to church because it's what they did and it was expected of me. And because of that, I was trying to look like I was fixed on the outside, but on the inside, I was still broken and shattered. But that all changed the summer after my sophomore year of high school, when I went on a missions trip to Mexico with my youth group to just build simple little houses for those in need. They were just little four-walled houses with a dirt floor, one door and one window, and that was it. And I really did not want to go on this trip. I didn't want to spend my summer, and not only spend my summer doing this, but pay to do it. And then you go hang out in Mexico, get all nasty and dirty and sweaty, building stuff for people, when I could be out doing my own thing, having some fun. But my mom talked me into going to this trip, so I decided, okay, I'll go. And it was during this trip that I actually got to know the guys in my small group, because before, since I was just going through the motions, I never let them get to know me. I never shared with them my passions or my struggles, and it was through this trip that I was finally able to open up to them and through them see what the Christian life really looked like. And so it was during that time that I actually made a decision to give my life to God, and it was through this trip that God restored me to a right relationship with Him. And that's what today is going to be about, God's power of restoration. And so that we're going to continue looking through Nehemiah, chapter 6, verse 15 to chapter 7, verse 5. And throughout the book, Nehemiah is focused on the restoration of the city of Jerusalem, mainly through the completion of the wall and the spiritual restoration of the people. And in this section of Nehemiah, we see the end of that physical restoration and the beginning of the spiritual restoration. And so to kick things off, I'd like to start by reading Nehemiah 6, 15 through 19 in the NIV. And it reads, "So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Also, in those days the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Era, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me." And so right off the bat, we see God restoring Israel. He starts off by saying that the wall was finished, and he says that it was on the 25th of Elul, which for us would be somewhere between August and September, just to give you a little reference. And what's amazing is not only was this wall restored to its former status in 52 days, but it was done in light of all the opposition that they faced, not only from the outside, but also from the inside, which we'll get into a little bit later. And one thing I found surprising was that in this 52 days, they weren't working on the Sabbath, and according to Josephus, the wall around Jerusalem at this time was roughly 6 miles long. So that's quite a project for them to have worked on. And then also in this, we see that it's not because the Israelites were such great contractors or they had the right connections they were able to get this done in time. It's recognized that it's because of God's help that this was done. And it's not because the Israelites recognized it, but because their enemies did. Turning back to verse 16, it says, "When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they had realized that this work had been done with the help of our God." It was people who didn't know the Israelites' God that recognized that it was with His help that they were able to do this, despite everything they were throwing at them. And also through the second half of these 4 verses, we see that Nehemiah's leadership is restored against Tobiah. Because Tobiah was out to get him. He not only was pressuring him himself with letters trying to intimidate him, but due to his connections with other Jews, he was using them to get to Nehemiah. He was using guys that were supposed to be helping rebuild the wall to try to put a stop to it. And he wasn't successful though. Nehemiah is still given victory over him in completing this task. And it's in these 4 verses, with the completion of the wall, that we see the first sign of the restoration of the city. Because without a wall, in those times, you can't really have a city. It's vital for protection because it keeps your enemies out, And without it, anyone can just walk on in and just do whatever they want to you. So following this, turning to chapter 7 now, verse 1, we read, "After the wall had been rebuilt, and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed." So here we see a restoration of some of the jobs of the people, and what's the start of the spiritual restoration of the people. And one thing that I found interesting was the role of the gatekeepers, because it makes sense that the Levites and singers would in some way be involved with the temple and temple life and worship. But I thought, reading the first part of this, talking about the wall, and the previous 6 chapters, that these gatekeepers were in charge of the actual wall that they rebuilt. But I found out through some cross-referencing that in 1 Chronicles 9, starting in verse 22, we see a description of what these gatekeepers did. So I'd like to read that with you. And speaking of the gatekeepers, it says, "Altogether, those chosen to be gatekeepers at the thresholds number 212. They were registered by genealogy in their villages. The gatekeepers had been assigned to their positions of trust by David and Samuel the seer. They and their descendants were in charge of guarding the gates of the house of the Lord, the house called the Tent. The gatekeepers were on the 4 sides, east, west, north, and south. Their brothers in their villages had to come from time to time and share their duties for 7-day periods. But the 4 principal gatekeepers, who were Levites, were entrusted with the responsibility for the rooms and treasuries in the house of God. They would spend the night stationed around the house of God because they had to guard it, and they had charge of the key for opening it each morning. Some of them were in charge of the articles used in the temple service. They counted them when they were brought in and when they were taken out. Others were assigned to take care of the furnishings and all the other articles of the sanctuary, as well as the flour and wine and the oil, incense and spices. But some of the priests took care of mixing the spices. A Levite named Mattathiah, the firstborn son of Shalom, the Korahite, was entrusted with the responsibility for baking the offering bread. Some of their Kohathite brothers were in charge of preparing for every Sabbath the bread set out on the table. And so we see that these people were removed from their positions by Nehemiah in order to help with the rebuilding of the wall, because it was such a monumental task. But by physically restoring the city to what it once was, Nehemiah is able to then restore these people back to their duties within the temple, which then allows the rest of the Israelites living in Jerusalem to focus on their lives and coming back to God. So before this, in the previous 6 verses, Nehemiah's entire focus is on the physical restoration of the city, which is just about come to an end. And this is where we start to move into the spiritual restoration of the people, which will continue on in later chapters. Now, ending with verses 2 through 5, we can see the beginning of the rest of the restoration of the city itself. Because it's not just enough to have the wall complete to restore the city, but we can see here that it's still in need of residents, and there's still repairs that need to be done. So turning back to Nehemiah 7 verse 2, it says, "I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most men do. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their own houses. Now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, officials, and the common people for registration by family. I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. This is what I found written there." So first, we see mention of Hanani and Hananiah, who are put in charge of the city of Jerusalem, which might seem confusing at first, because clearly before all this, Nehemiah is in charge of the city and in charge of what's going on. But if you look back to chapter 1, it makes sense that he would need to find people that he trusts to run the city for him in his absence, because he makes a promise to the king that he will return after a set period of time. And so, with all the opposition that he faced from Jews on the inside, he couldn't just give the task to anyone. It had to be people who feared God and followed him to take care of the city in his absence.